All right, good afternoon, and welcome to perhaps the last session of this day, which is all about fortifying your security controls using Microsoft Entra. Before I kickstart, a special shout out to our sponsors, the few that have been here, which sort of made this even possible for all of us as community members. As I said, today's topic is more about empowering security and accelerating your zero trust journey using Microsoft Entra. So before I get started, quick show of hands if you are using Microsoft Entra today. You are using?
So I was kind of in touch with Azure Active Directory. I think the transformation when it happened, well, I'm not very inclined to that. But then would like to understand the differences and why.
Yeah, so to make it very simple, Azure AD is what they refer to as Microsoft Entra now. Very black and white. So what Microsoft has done sort of in the last 18 months is they've renamed Azure Active Directory and added more security capabilities there. And the intent is to go ahead and offer you the same controls, governance capabilities from different aspects. So it's not just an identity and access management solution, but it covers end-to-end capabilities. So think about traditional vendors such as SailPoint. Those capabilities were not there originally. Now we've got those sort of capabilities as well with Microsoft Entra. So that's just one example. So today I'm going to focus more on that zero trust aspects, but more questions the merrier. We've got a small group, so let's make it more interactive. Let's talk and get to know what's happening here. But before I get started, just so you all know me, my name is Ankul. I currently work at Lab3 as a principal security technologist. What that simply means is I work with customers, understanding all the way from their business requirements to, delivering the relevant solution. I have been at Microsoft and AWS, so I do understand how the ecosystem works from both different sides and, what are the right things that a customer requires. I'm on a bit of a social media detox these days. That's why you see that column being empty, but I will share my email address at the end of the day. So should anyone like to, connect with me, go for it. My passions, my hobbies, I love doing a lot of tech talks at various events. That's perhaps why I'm saying I've seen some of you either at a meetup or perhaps you've been an ex-colleague of mine some way or the other. So let's talk about what we're going to discuss today. So today we are going to talk about the modern threat landscape and the steps that you all can take to stay ahead of these attackers from the identity perspective. So what I'm going to do is do a bit of a talk about what are the tools, the capabilities, why would you implement them, then do a bit of a demo and keep going from there. Now, I was going through a few stats last week, and this report from Forbes was a very interesting one that I looked at. And what it essentially suggests is that 87% of these surveyed businesses last year have identified cyber threats as their number one concern when it comes to their financial health. Over half of these surveyed businesses have unfortunately been attacked once or more from their environment perspective. But more importantly, 1 out of these 5 businesses said the impact of the attack was substantial enough to threaten their existence. So what this really means is, since COVID-19, as we have started to transition into a hybrid working model, and it seems to be working really well for many organizations, these cyber threats, these cyber crimes have gone up significantly. Somewhere I read it's about 300% surge. But what's even more concerning is that cyber crimes have now become a highly profitable business, even surpassing the illegal drugs trade. So what attackers are doing is they're investing in sophisticated tools and techniques to maximize their financial gains. So that's the world where we live in today. Now, another key thing that I have observed in the industry is there's been a rising tide of these ransomware attacks that have been following us for the last many years. And what that really means for us is, as a business, we end up paying, thousands to millions of dollars to gain access back to our valuable assets. If you look at the numbers, in 2021, this was right around $500,000, whereas in 2023, this has increased 3 times. Any one of you want to take a guess on what this looks like in 2024? This is the average ransomware payment that businesses make to recoup access to their assets. Yeah, it's going to double up again. So it's going to be right around 3.1-ish is what they expect. And the trend seems to be going up every year, unfortunately. So, moving forward, a few more numbers, because numbers scare us a lot. The average cost of a global data breach for medium to large enterprise organizations is right around that $3.9 million mark. For bigger enterprises like Targets who have been data breached in the last 10 years, this amount is probably 4 to 5 times to what we have here. But more importantly is the amount of time it takes on an average to detect a data breach. It's right around that 6 months period. So imagine a data breach has happened. Attackers have been able to infiltrate your environment. They are seeing what different types of data you're storing at different places. They're also able to work out the relevant techniques to perform lateral movement and even work out the ways to exfiltrate that data out of your environment. And for us as a business, 6 months we keep a blind eye on that. Imagine the amount of reputational damage that you would have at the end of the day when you would actually detect something has happened. By the time it's that 180th day, the 6th month, it's game over, right?
So are you saying, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So are you saying that even after deploying the right tools and security controls, it's taking 6 months for us to detect that? Or?
Absolutely. So one of the key challenges that I see when I talk to a lot of my customers is that they've got a bouquet of security tools that are deployed within the environment. And what these tools are doing is they're doing a great job in their own vertical, but they're siloed. So an identity tool is doing a great job in its silo. An endpoint detection and response tool is doing a great job in its silo. But what they're not doing together is to talk to each other, share that knowledge, and build that homogeneous security experience for all of you here. And what that really means at the end of the day is that information is available, but because it's not shared, so those incidents that are low valued from a blind eye are working together to attack our environment holistically. That's essentially what we are looking at today. Do you people see similar type of observations in your organizations where you work?
Yeah, I think that's the right thing you said. There are too many tools, and then probably are not talking to each other. Probably you might see 2 or 3 kind of categories of tool being used in the same organization in different departments as well.
Absolutely.
So that's the gray also.
And if you listen to Gartner, their number 1 cybersecurity recommendation today is to consolidate your security tools. What they're saying is you might have 15 or 20 of them. That's great. Start moving towards 4 or 5 of them. Consolidate them as much as possible. A, because you can share more telemetry with each other, which means they'll be able to identify risks and go from there. But B, you'll have better return on your investments as well. Each vendor will have their own licensing model and you'll be tied to that. Whereas when you bring it under one ecosystem, then that means you get a better financial returns as well because you're not engaging 5 different vendors. But also from an operational efficiency perspective as well, right? Before I was managing 5 different tools, maybe I had 3 or 4 different people who were managing those 5 tools. Now, I probably have 1 or 2 people who can manage those 5 tools and deliver a better value for my organization. So that's perhaps one of the key benefit of consolidating your security tools as well. So the question that we all have in mind is, what can we all do to stay ahead of these threats and protect our organizations? So when we think about this type of a scenario, there are 3 different things that I'm going to talk about today from an identity security perspective. The first one is more around strengthening your authentication controls, your authentication methods. Second one, performing real-time risk assessment for your identity. And what that really means is don't leave your tools to identify threats on an offline basis. As your users are logging into the environments, understand what risks are cropping up and respond to them there and then. And lastly, based on those risk levels that have been identified, build dynamic access controls. So, for example, if a user is coming from a dark node IP address, you perhaps want to decline that authentication request, no matter what's the context, right? So you want to just abandon that request there and then, rather than letting it come first and then you detect what had happened. So those are the kind of controls that you would be looking forward to implementing within your environment. So let's talk about, first of all, from a Microsoft Entra security perspective, how can you strengthen your authentication methods? Now, all of you access various applications within your environment, right? Give me name of 2 favorite applications that you access all the time. Teams, yeah. ServiceNow, yeah. A common pattern is you would need to authenticate to those applications in order to gain access, be it through single sign-on or some other mechanism. So when we think about authentication, the first thing that crops up straight away is username and password. It's something that we have been using for a very long time. Now, passwords today are not a great method for authenticating users for a few different reasons. Firstly, attackers can run a brute force attack. It's pretty easy to run a dictionary attack and probably get 80% passwords that users are using. In fact, if you go to various websites, you get a list of database on passwords that have been cracked and compromised already. That's one part. Second part is attackers today use these sophisticated tools to perform various different types of phishing attacks, social engineering type of attacks. I get surprised the amount of calls that people receive today saying, I'm calling from the ATO, I need your MyGov password now so I can make sure that your settings are working fine, or this is a fine that is there for you, you haven't paid for it. So what that means is if you're just using an authentication method such as password, it's very easily compromised. Not great for us. So one of the key things that every enterprise is trying to do today is to elevate from that single authentication method to perhaps a multi-factor authentication. Now, from a Microsoft Entra perspective, what you would find is there are a wide range of different authentication methods that are available to us that we can leverage to uplift the authentication capabilities. What you would see if we go from the bottom to the top, there would be methods such as your passwords, your voice calls. Those are the methods that we typically recommend not to use anymore. Why? Because they are easily hackable. So a few years back, one of the very well-known white-hat hacker in the industry, proved to us how easy was it to just leverage social engineering on users and get access to their password or a PIN code that was sent to their phone. You just call the user, you talk through them, and they'll give you that. So that's one of the key challenges. But as you go above in that list, you would see the security measures strengthen more and more. So think about things such as your FIDO keys as a very good example that are hardware tokens. So you have to plug them into your device in order to make sure that you're able to successfully authenticate. You've got Microsoft Authenticator app that you can use on your favorite platform, your iOS, your Androids. And what it will do is it will give you a prompt. Windows Hello for Business, perhaps one of the best second factor authentication that you should consider using. Why? Because you don't really have to even enter the password. It will do a facial recognition as an example. So you can use that as a primary form of authentication as well. And then on the other side, you see the usability. We unfortunately still see a lot of people using passwords, voice calls, text messages as their secondary factor of authentication. So the intent is that you move away from some of these low-hanging fruits and start using capabilities such as your FIDO keys, your Windows Hello for Businesses, your Microsoft Authenticator-based app in order to further secure your authentication method. Another key thing that I always suggest to my customers is engage your users, because what happens is people move from one spectrum of single-factor authentication to doing a multi-factor authentication on everything, which is the extreme end. And what that really brings on board is MFA fatigue. People get MFA requests for everything, and then they just start approving anything and everything without thinking what they're approving. So one of the other key things that you might want to improve within your environment is have MFA-based request that engages a user. For example, they get a prompt on their Authenticator app where they need to enter a number. And what that app will also show you is, where the location from where the request is coming, what application is requiring that request. So when the user looks at, application ServiceNow, they can say, oh, I'm not even using ServiceNow, and the request is coming from Adelaide, but I'm perhaps based in Melbourne right now. This doesn't look right. They can deny that request. That way you are actually engaging that user. So those are the kind of things that you really want to implement to improve on your authentication strength as well. And this is sort of a good list that shows to us what are some of the key authentication methods that you can leverage as the primary ones and as the secondary ones as well. If you ask me personally, the ones that I would suggest, if possible today, is move more towards that passwordless type of an authentication. So your Windows Hello for Business is a pretty good example. If you're using Windows 10 or Windows 11 and you've got the right type of hardware, perhaps the best form of authentication that you can use today. But not every organization has that capability, right? So what can you do? Think about, in those instances, perhaps using at least Microsoft Authenticator app as that second form of authentication to give you the right level of protection. If feasible, use FIDO keys or the equivalent third-party ones to further strengthen that one. So what I'm going to do is I am actually going to go to the Azure portal, or the Entra portal I should say, and I'm going to show you how does this actually look like as well. So this is the Microsoft Entra portal. So as I mentioned earlier, Azure Active Directory is now rebranded into something called Microsoft Entra. And Microsoft Entra has, all of the relevant security features related to identity. So right now, I would focus more in the stream of protection today. And firstly, I want to talk about these authentication methods that are here. Now, within these authentication methods, you would see there are quite a large number of authentication methods that are available. So right now you see within my environment, I've just enabled the email one-time passcode based authentication, but it's pretty easy to enable the other ones as well, such as Authenticator app. I'll just click on it, say enable. I can specify the selected users or the entire organization for which you want to enable this. My suggestion when I've done this for customers is to create a group and you add users there rather than just enabling across all organization, because you need to factor things such as your break glass accounts and how do you exclude them from some of these things as well. And then to engage your user, so where I was saying, engage your user, use their brain power rather than just clicking on everything, you come to the configure section of it. So what you can do is you can say require number matching for push notifications, so they need to enter that number, show the name of the application, which is requiring that authentication there. Tell them the geography from where the request is coming from. So these are some of the settings that you might want to enable for each of these capabilities. That's the first bit. Apart from this, what Microsoft has also done really well for us is to give us something called these authentication strengths. So what you would find with authentication strengths is this is just a combination of various authentication methods that you can leverage to further strengthen your authentication. And where this comes really handy is when you use conditional access policies, which we'll talk about a bit later today as well. So you see right now they've built 3 of them for us. The first one is multi-factor authentication, which will have some methods. So if I click on it, it shows I can use a combination of Windows Hello for Business, passkeys such as FIDO, certificate-based authentication, Microsoft Authenticator, and all the other ones. The interesting one is the last one, which says phishing-resistant MFA. If you see this one, it only has 3 different methods: certificate-based authentication, Windows Hello for Business, or FIDO keys. You all might be wondering, it's actually missing things such as password as well as authenticator app. Why is that the case? Any one of you want to take a bit of a guess?
They can be used for phishing.
Pretty much. What you're trying to do in this particular authentication strength is to remove out user from the equation completely. So when we are thinking about phishing type of activities, we know in the entire thread chain, the weakest link is the user. User can unfortunately be compromised a lot easier way rather than playing around with the AI.
I think you mean the password, right? But that's
Yeah.
the user, because the Windows Hello for Business user is actually required.
Go again?
For Windows Hello for Business,
It's going to do facial recognition, but not ask you to enter your password. Go ahead.
I mean, for Windows Hello, if the face recognition doesn't work, it asks you a PIN number. Your PIN number is 4-digit. What's the difference then between a PIN and a password? Like PIN 4-character, password 8, and like the PIN's only numbers.
Good question there.
How does Windows Hello then PIN is better than password?
That PIN that you have is local to that device. So for example, if I have access to your PIN, it's for that local device only. So I can only gain access to the laptop, but then when I try to do other things, access a sensitive application, hopefully you've got other mechanisms such as conditional access policy for that sensitive application. So they won't be able to go very far with just having access to your device. Now, surely if you have a file called password.txt on your device, where you've actually stored all the usernames and password, there is a bigger challenge that we need to address there. So this strengthened method is essentially saying to us, remove the user out of the equation, even don't have authenticator app where, I can call the user saying, hey, make sure that you enter 92 on your app, which will give you a push notification and go on from there. It's actually cutting the user completely from the equation. What you can do is, if you require, you can create your new authentication strength as well. So if I say a name of global bootcamp auth strength, I can choose different methods from here. So for example, I want to include everything within phishing resistance MFA, perhaps in passwordless as well, and multi-factor. What I want to leave out for this one is single factor authentication. So SMS, password, those types of things. I'll do that and say create. And then once I've created this authentication strength, I can then further leverage this as part of my conditional access policies that I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. So that's the first aspect that you can consider from uplifting your authentication strength and method perspective. The next thing that comes here is identity protection. So Microsoft Entra Identity Protection is a capability that they offer to us to detect, investigate, and remediate identity-based attack on a real-time basis. So this is sort of where Microsoft leverages their built-in threat intelligence. They capture our signals, so they capture the telemetry from millions of users who are using Microsoft Entra as their authentication platform, and then observe the patterns, and then based on those patterns, it builds their threat intelligence and enrich that threat intelligence to your environment. And what that really means is using the platform-built AI and the threat intelligence, it's able to detect if your user in real time is logging in from a risky setup or their authentication request is genuine. So within identity protection, what you would find is there are two ways of identifying these risks. The first one is risk based on the session, so the risky user type of a thing. The second risk is holistically on the user profile, and the last one is also risky apps. Again, this is a capability that you can easily integrate with conditional access policy for identifying and remediating those risks. Be aware, if you are going to leverage identity protection, you would require a Microsoft Entra Premium P2 type of license to enable this capability. Now, when we talk about these different types of risks, let's first talk about the sign-in risk. Now, there are these different risk detection parameters that Microsoft leverages to detect the risk. You would find some of these ones are real-time, such as your anonymous IP address. So if, for example, you try to log in from a Tor web browser, it will give you that anonymous IP address, and it will raise a risk in real time and give you the capability to actually investigate and mitigate that risk with conditional access policy. But then you would also see there are a lot of these detection mechanisms that are available on an offline basis. So it will still use those parameters within the environment and then go ahead and holistically build that user's profile and see, was there genuinely a risk? If yes, then it will sort of detect that risky user as well. So the second part is where it says risky users or user risk. So this is sort of where it's building that holistic profile, i.e. a user, take my example. I'm based in Melbourne, so most of my authentication requests do come from Melbourne. Suddenly, we see my authentication requests are coming from Singapore, China, Russia, or different parts of the world. There's genuinely something wrong there, and you probably need to revoke that session and perhaps ask the user to do something from there. So that's where it's building that profile. Another way where it uses this capability is it looks at the type of activities that the user is performing and then maps it back to the common activities that sort of indicate there's a compromise on the user's identity. And when it matches those type of patterns, it can uplift that risk here as well. So identity protection as a capability is a premium P2 capability. Conditional access policy is a premium P1. So this is more of an add-on that you can enable within your conditional access policies, and if you do that, you would require a P2 license for that one. Non-premium is P1, yeah. So yeah.
Another question. When you say detection type offline,
Mm-hmm.
what is the definition of offline?
So
How long does it take to detect it?
So offline is, it will keep collecting that telemetry. So take an example of anomalous user activity. It will keep a track of the type of activities that the user is performing. And once it has observed the pattern by building a user's profile, and if it matches something that is abnormal, that's where it will flag it up as a risky user.
Yeah. And then you have your corresponding conditional access policy to do either prompt for MFA or something like that.
Correct. So if we go back to our Azure portal Go ahead.
So say for example, there is a person and he has got some VPN software installed and then he's trying to log in from a particular region which he is not into, right?
Mhm.
Will that kind of things will be flagged as anonymous?
It will flag it as a risky user because it's an unknown IP address, perhaps an anonymous IP address.
But then that IP address is from that country itself, right?
Correct. It could be from another country, it could be from the same country. So what you can do is you can go to identity protection and train the AI model saying, yes, you've flagged this as a risky user, but I'm okay to say this is a genuine request.
So let me give you an example. Say for example, I'm an Indian employee, okay?
Mm-hmm.
My company is in India, but I'm here, right? I'm working from Melbourne. What I'm doing is I'm connecting to some VPN to get access to Indian IP, and from there I'm logging to my, that remote extract or whatever.
Sure.
So in those cases, how does this identify those use case scenarios?
It will, as I said, it will still flag it.
Okay.
So what you can do is, within the risky users, as an example, you would see that risky user propping up here, and you can actually say that AI has identified this as a risky user, but I'm okay to say the user is not compromised. So then next time when the user logs in from the same IP address from the same VPN, it will say, oh no, the administrator actually told me earlier that this is a safe IP address, so I don't need to flag it as a risk.
Basically, there has to be a manual intervention, and that has to be, that person has intelligently understand whether that is a right IP or not, right?
Two ways of handling this.
But then ultimately, I'm sorry, I'm asking another question. Ultimately, it's going to be a public IP itself, right? Whether I'm logging from Pune, India, or whether I'm logging from Melbourne via VPN connecting to Indian servers, both will have public IP.
Correct. So let me complete. So in either way, there are two mechanisms of handling this. Number one is a human interjecting and saying, this is a genuine request. The other way is you leverage this telemetry information from identity protection into your conditional access policy. When it flags as a risky user, you might want to say, risky user detected. That's fine. Let's ask the user to perform a multi-factor authentication. So you would get a prompt, let's say on Authenticator, saying enter the number, app X, IP location, India. Yeah, that's fine. You know it's expected behavior. You say yes, approve.
So that's where
AI will get trained. Exactly.
Conditional access.
Correct.
Enforce the user. Correct.
So what you would find here within identity protection is there are two policy engines in a way, if I have to put it. You've got the user risk policy, which is based on the holistic user risk patterns, and then there is sign-in risk policy. So sign-in risk policy is specific to a session when you're trying to log in. User risk policy is holistically looking at your user account. Now, what Microsoft recommends us from the last sort of 6 to 8 months is don't configure these policies here. Configure this as part of your conditional access policy. In fact, at some stage in 2025, they'll even not allow us to configure it from here. You can still use this telemetry, but configure it as part of your conditional access policy. So what you would do is you would configure your user risk policy, your sign-in risk policy from conditional access policy, and then go. What you would get from identity protection is an identified list of your risky users. So let me just say everything. And here they've identified an administrator as a risky user, for example. Now you can see here, when was the risk last time updated? So 18th of the March. What was the risk level? It was low. Then it also talks about the risk state. It says high. You can even go ahead and look at the recent risky sign-ins for this particular user. You can see any detections. You can see any risk history. So in this particular incident, if I click on this risk history, it tells me that this was unfamiliar sign-in property. So I can investigate it from here as a human, as an administrator. And let's just say I find the user to be safe. I can go ahead and say dismiss user risk. Equally, I can say confirm user compromised. That's the human intervention part. As an administrator, you would be doing that. In fact, I remember back in the day when I was at Microsoft, to test how well our SOC used to work, people used to run Mimikatz and other tools on the Microsoft corporate device, and what would happen is, in few minutes, we will get a Teams message from someone saying, your laptop is now being isolated, and you need to follow these bunch of steps, which pretty much was clean up the device, format it, and then we'll only enable it back in the environment. So you can do those type of malicious things, and we saw how proactive the SOC was there, that within few minutes we used to get those messages, and it was a long process, so you would probably not do it on a production laptop, might leverage a jump host or something and do it there. That's the first part. The other thing that you probably want to leverage is these different types of reports. So your risky user reports, your risky sign-in reports. The interesting other one is your risky workload identity. So some of you who work in the Azure ecosystem, you might have heard about service principals or managed identities, right? You probably want to know, is there a compromise on that managed identity that you're using? It can actually go ahead and detect your managed identity-based risks as well and flag it within the portal.
Question with the managed identity, it's almost like a known entity. We know which subscription, which feature, which resource could give the burden. So how would it detect a risk for something that is pretty static in essence? It's not moving, right? It's not like a user that can log in from another location or not egress. What kind of risks would you see?
In that type of an example, a risk could be that you have leveraged a managed identity that was assigned to a virtual machine to, let's say, yeah, exactly. So let's say a virtual machine that was accessing a storage account, and let's just say storage account A, but now it's actually accessing a web app, or it's accessing your load balancer or something else, which, exactly. So that flags up a bit of a risk there. Any other questions on identity protection? Actually, how many of you use it today? You use it?
Usually I put it in the report only, and one of the things is obviously this is quite a full-time activity to review these, take actions, like the manual activity that you were saying, right? I mean, try to put as much as automation as possible to pushing the load onto the conditional access policies to make sure that, but, and we have also try to integrate these information with SIEM, like Sentinel, so that you get something centralized. But then still, I mean, the SOC, I think, I don't know how the whole wide industry-wide, I don't think SOC has the same level of maturity across the organization.
I agree with you. So let's
put it subtly.
There are a few different ways of me answering that. One way is perhaps SOC needs to go on that maturity journey of building a lot more automation in terms of its response patterns, i.e. identifying a risky user, blocking it via automation rather than waiting for a human to do something. That's one example. The other bit is, you've probably all heard Microsoft has Copilot for security as an example. That comes in really handy for organizations where you have an internal security team which is performing the SOC tasks as well, but they're not that mature. So all of those level 1 type of detection tasks, you can now let Copilot for security handle on behalf of you rather than someone actually performing those tasks. But yes, it's a journey. It's not something that you can achieve overnight. I fully appreciate that feedback. Okay. Now, all of these tools or capabilities, your authentication methods, your identity protection telemetry, even data from other Microsoft solutions such as Defender for Cloud Apps, which is their cloud app security broker type of capability. All of this sort of feeds into something called conditional access policy, which in simple terms, as I think about it, is Microsoft's one-stop tool to implement any identity-based controls. So what you do is you enrich everything from identity perspective, from users' device endpoint, from identity protection tools, your cloud app security broker, Defender for cloud apps, so on and so forth. And all of that telemetry gets fed into conditional access policy. As the name suggests, it is an if-then type of statements that you sort of write as a policy. If a user is accessing an application and the signals that you're receiving from their identity, from their device, from their accessing are malicious, then what to do? It could be as simple as multi-factor authentication, prompting them to do that. Another way of thinking of this is blocking that request completely. Those are the different types of controls that you can implement. So conditional access policy is Microsoft's tool here to implement that zero trust type of architecture from an identity-based control aspect. What you would find is conditional access policy works on three things. The first one is your assignment, so your policy applications. The second one are the conditions that trigger the policy. And the last one is your controls. So what are the different types of controls that you want to apply there? Now, when you are implementing these conditional access policies, a few things to remember. Firstly, all of these conditional access policies are evaluated first. So it's not that the first policy that is matched, it will apply those controls. It will go through all the policies. If you want to, remove a user or exclude a user from getting that policy applied, use the exclusion option. It's there for that reason. Break glass accounts are a very good reason for that exclusion type of an option. You would need an account that will help you out on your bad day, right? From an assignments perspective, you would see there are a few different types of assignment. You've got your users and groups. You've got your directory roles, such as Teams administrator, as a good example. And then lastly, you've also got, users and groups where you probably want to implement. Then you've got these different types of conditions as well, be it user-based risk, your sign-in risk, which is all coming from identity protection. You've got your insider risk, which is a new capability that Microsoft has recently added on in conditional access policies. So now it actually gets data from Microsoft Purview. So the type of risky activities that your user might be performing from that data handling perspective and enrich that in conditional access policy. The locations from where they are logging in, your client applications. So are they using mobile-based application, web-based application, or they're using a legacy application, because legacy application doesn't support modern authentication prompts. And lastly, filter for devices as well. So are they logging in from a Dell laptop? Are they logging in from a HP laptop? You can even configure those type of things. So what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to take you straight to the portal, and let's actually create a conditional access policy from here. What you would also find in conditional access policy is, apart from those conditions that we have talked about, you can even create terms of use as well. So when your user is logging in from the first time, you can make them accept these terms of use at the same time. You talked about a scenario for VPN connectivity. Conditional access policy caters for that now as well within this VPN connectivity option as well. So let's, yeah.
What is the terms of use? It will be only prompted for the first time the user is.
You can do it for the first time, or you can do it every time that they're logging in, like a banner. So depending on the way.
Feature I don't recall probably the first time users are enforced to set a MFA mechanism or something. Is it the same or something else?
So,
you can enforce through that?
so that feature is to onboard users to multi-factor authentication. There's now a unified approach to do that, where you can do MFA and SSPR together. So you can enforce that one as well. Conditional access policy will be more useful on an ongoing basis when you're accessing a specific application. So if we take an example here of creating a conditional access policy, let's give it a name. So global bootcamp policy. the first thing that I want to do is which users are getting this policy. I'm going to say selected users, and I'm going to say a user group. Let's just target my sales team here as an example. So I'll just say sales team, this particular group. The next bit is what are the different target resources. You can go with all cloud apps, or you can go with selected ones. So here, as an example, what I want to do is I want to force this policy for, let's say, Salesforce application, which is my CRM system. I want to be very mindful when my sales team is accessing this particular application. The next aspect that I would then do is implement those conditions that we were talking about. So remember, we talked about the user risk policy, the sign-in risk policy. Both of that can be configured from here. So for example, if my user's sign-in risk is high, so I need to first enable that, and then say if my sign-in risk is high or medium, as an example, I'll select that. What I really want to do is I'm okay to grant them access, but I want them to MFA. And even better, what I'm going to do is I'm going to integrate my authentication strength that I created earlier, and I'm going to select that specific authentication strength that I created. So I'll use my global bootcamp one and select. And the last thing that you can do here is you can enable this policy in a read-only mode and then click on create. Why I would suggest to create this policy in the read-only mode is, enable the policy in a read-only mode, collect the telemetry, and see what is the end user impact. You don't want to have a policy that might deny users' request without going through a proper change communication, right? What you probably want to do is create that policy, collect that telemetry for the first 14 days, understand which users are frequently impacted by this change, work with them on a one-to-one basis, go through your organizational communication and change, and then release these conditional access policies. In fact, I'll skip a few slides and I'll share this deck with everyone so you can basically go through this. What you would find is when you're creating these conditional access policies, there are a few key design decisions that you would have to make. The first one is have a proper naming standard. Rather than just creating a global bootcamp policy name, have a standard naming convention, use that across your organization. Think about the personas for which you want to implement this policy. It could be a persona of a standard user, an administrator, i.e. a privileged user, an external user who is a contractor to your organization, so on and so forth. Think about how you're going to review access of that conditional access policy, probably on a quarterly basis, annual basis, half yearly basis, those type of things. SIEM integration is very important. Sure, you've done all of this great work in identity, but if you don't log it in your SIEM solution, then it can't enrich with other different telemetries from which your SIEM is collecting logs as well. And lastly, think about your monitoring and break glass type of capabilities here as well. So these are some of the personas that I could think of where you would implement conditional access policy. So one, as a common example, is global. So this is across the organization, a universal one that you perhaps want to implement. Similarly, your admins, your developers might have some specific type of conditions that might be different. You want to implement a conditional access policy there as well. You might want to have a different conditional access policy for your guest users as well. So think about all of those aspects. In fact, you can now do a conditional access policy for your workload identities as well. So that type of capability also exists.
Can you just go back?
Yeah, go ahead.
On the guest account, that's B2B integration.
Mhm.
So if you do conditional access policy to prompt for MFA, essentially they are not getting any single sign-on experience, aren't they?
Correct. So the authentication will still be within their tenant,
Yeah.
and then only you can implement that conditional access policy.
Yeah, but then since it is not initiated from my tenant,
Mhm.
every time they want to access, they will be prompted for that.
So remember, there are cross-tenant settings as well that you can implement at your tenant level with a partner organization. And once you have implemented those cross-tenant configuration settings, this becomes a lot easier.
So you can trust that.
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
okay. All right.
So that's one of the reasons why those cross-tenant settings are really handy.
Oh, okay. So you only do that with your partner organization. So you trust the claim so that they don't. Oh.
Yeah.
My question is, how is this service accounts different with the workload identities?
Same thing.
Same thing.
Yeah, same thing. And this is just a bit of a roadmap that you can leverage to roll out these conditional access policies. So typically start with your report only mode for your ring 0, then enable it for ring 0. So ring 0 for me in most instances is predominantly your IT users, or it could be an amalgamation of few users from IT, few users from other departments. Start with them, work with them. Once ring 0 is successful, then move to ring 1, ring 2, and then across the enterprise rather than a big bang one. So this is what I had for all of you today. Thank you so much for attending the session.